I parked calmly in front of my house when two men in uniform approached me, demanding a fine for an illegal parking violation. They were sure I would just get scared and pay, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. When I pulled out my phone and said I was calling the department, their faces changed instantly. But what happened next? Even I didn't see it coming. Mark Davis was a man of principles. Over his 20-year career as a judge, he had handled all kinds of cases, from petty disputes to high-profile criminal trials. He believed in the law. He had seen it in action, and even when his rulings were unpopular, he knew he was acting in the name of justice. That was his job, his duty. But sometimes, life threw situations at him that didn't fit into any legal precedent. The day had been particularly exhausting. 3 hearings in a row, endless arguments, lawyers constantly interrupting each other, and a final fraud case that once again made him question the nature of human greed. Ironically, it was that very topic that would confront him just minutes after he stepped out of his car. He arrived home late at night, a typical evening, a typical parking spot. Mark pulled into his usual space, grabbed his briefcase, and was just about to head toward the entrance when he heard a firm, cold voice behind him. "Sir, stop right there." Mark turned around. 2 men in police uniforms stood in front of him. Something about them felt off right away. The first, tall, thin, with a shaved head, had a badge on his chest that didn't quite look right. Mark knew exactly what real police credentials were supposed to look like, and this one seemed more like a cheap replica than an actual emblem of authority. The second man was shorter and stockier, with a thick mustache and an awkward posture that didn't match the presence of a real officer. He stood like someone who had just put on the uniform for the first time and hadn't yet learned how to wear it. "You violated parking regulations, sir. We'll have to issue you a fine." The bald one's voice was overly strict, almost theatrical. Mark frowned slightly. A violation? He knew the parking rules better than most of his neighbors. He had lived in this complex for 7 years and had always parked in the same spot. No real police officer had ever stopped him here before. "Where exactly did I violate the rules?" he asked calmly, watching them closely. "Parking in this area is reserved for residents only," the mustached one replied. Mark barely stopped himself from laughing. He raised an eyebrow slightly and nodded toward the building behind him. "I live here." He expected that to be the end of the conversation, but the men didn't even flinch. "We don't care," the bald one said, his voice carrying a strange sense of entitlement. "Either you pay the fine, or your car gets towed. A fine? For parking in his own spot?" A sharp wave of anger ignited in Mark's chest. He had seen fraudsters in the courtroom. He had read about them in case files. But this was the first time they had tried to scam him face to face. Mark was a man who could see through lies. Over his years in the courtroom, he had watched thousands of people try to lie. Some got nervous, others lied with confidence, and some tripped over their own words. And he always knew exactly what gave a liar away. These two looked overly self-assured, but Mark picked up on the small details that exposed them completely. First, the uniforms. They were too clean, like they had just come off a store shelf, and they didn't sit naturally on them. Real police officers wear their uniforms like a second skin. These two looked like they had just put them on and had no idea how to move in them. Second, the badges. They looked cheap, like knockoffs from a low-quality website. But what really caught Mark's attention was the bald man's eyes. The moment he spoke, his eyes twitched for a split second, as if he was instinctively bracing for exposure. They were frauds, but Mark wasn't in a hurry to reveal his hand. "Let me see your credentials," he said, his voice like ice. The mustached man, the shorter, stockier one, hesitated at first, but quickly regained his composure. "What credentials?" he scoffed. "We already introduced ourselves." "Introduced themselves?" Mark smirked internally. "So, you're police officers?" he asked, watching their every move. "Of course." The bald man nodded too quickly. Too quickly. Mark caught the flicker of panic in his eyes again. That split-second realization when a liar knows they've been caught but still tries to hold the facade together. "You're interfering with police work," the bald one added, a bit too forcefully. At that moment, Mark was sure they were lying. But what infuriated him most was their confidence. They acted as if they were untouchable, as if they could lie, intimidate, and get away with it. Not today. "All right. Then I'll just call the department and verify your badge numbers," Mark said calmly, pulling out his phone. Their reaction was immediate. The mustached man, who had been the cockiest one a moment ago, took a sudden step back. "Listen, mister. There's no need to make this complicated." His voice had lost its previous arrogance. But Mark wasn't stopping. He took a step forward, deliberately keeping his phone in plain view. "You know what's interesting? Unlike you, I actually have the authority to assess the legality of an officer's actions." He paused for effect. "Because I'm a judge." Everything changed instantly. The bald man's face contorted in shock. "What?" he barely managed to say. Now they were afraid, and soon they would know exactly how that fear felt. Judges don't shout. They speak in a way that makes every word weigh a ton, and right now he was using that exact tone. "I said, I'm a judge." His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. The bald man and the mustached one froze for a moment, exchanging glances. They had just taken a hit they clearly weren't expecting, but Mark didn't give them time to process it. "And you know what's even more interesting?" He paused for a second. "Pauses are power. Impersonating a police officer is a criminal offense." The bald man blinked sharply, his eyes darting around, checking for witnesses. The mustached one shifted on his feet, suddenly looking uneasy. Now they were both nervous, and yet they still thought they could weasel their way out. "Sir, let's not make this any worse." The mustached man forced a fake smile, as cheap as his uniform. "Maybe we can settle this another way?" Mark's jaw tightened. The audacity. Even after finding out who he was, even after realizing they had been exposed, they were still trying to negotiate. "That, gentlemen, is called extortion," Mark said coldly, his phone still in clear view. "You just sealed your own fate." That was it. Their nerves broke. The bald man, finally realizing the situation was slipping out of his control, whirled around without a word and flung his ticket book to the ground. A quick pivot, fast steps toward the alley. The mustached one was right behind him. But Mark wasn't about to let them go. He quickly switched on video recording and spoke loudly, clearly, with an authority that left no room for doubt. "If you don't want to be arrested right now, you'd better stop where you are." But they didn't stop. The bald one picked up the pace. The mustached one was almost running now. And then Mark saw him, a real police officer, stepping out of the nearby store, fully equipped, a real badge, real authority. And the scammers were running straight toward him. Now justice was finally catching up to them. He moved decisively toward the only person in uniform who actually had the right to wear it, the real police officer stepping out of the store. Tall, solid, with a sharp, unwavering gaze. "Officer!" Mark's voice was firm and commanding. "These two were impersonating police officers and trying to extort money from me. I have video proof." He turned his phone around and showed the recording. The real cop snapped into action immediately. His eyes locked onto the fleeing imposters, and in an instant, everything changed. "Stop! Hands up!" His voice tore through the air. It was so loud, so charged with authority, that the scammers froze instinctively. The bald man stopped so suddenly he nearly lost his balance. The mustached one, still clinging to the hope of escape, raised his hands and started backing away. "This is a mistake. We just—" But excuses didn't matter anymore. Click. The bald man's wrists snapped into handcuffs first. Click. The mustached one got his a second later. They were trapped. Mark watched in silence as the con men were loaded into the patrol car. All that was left for them now was disappointment, fear, and the crushing realization that they had lost. He didn't feel vindictive. He felt satisfied. This was the right ending. Justice had prevailed.